Party opposes it.
Call Eugenie Sage.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker. Local government has an enormous influence on nature, on our quality of life, our neighbourhoods and the way our communities function. It has a crucial role in creating the places and communities that are safe, pleasant to live, play, work and retire in. The Act was significantly overhauled and changed in 2002. The intention then was to empower local communities. Local authorities were intended to be the instruments of local democracy through which communities achieved the outcomes they aspired to. This bill winds back that philosophy. It winds back the philosophy of councils being the instruments of their communities. By changing the purpose of local government and dropping the requirement to promote the four well-beings, it will restrict councils to nuts and bolts activities. This potentially prevents them from being the arm around their communities, from undertaking activities such as a very successful Christchurch City Council's Kids Fest school holiday program, or providing affordable rental accommodation. And as the regulatory impact statement on the Better Local Government discussion paper notes, that there may well be unintended consequences around changing the purpose of local government, because that whole concept of well-being is woven throughout the Principal Act and throughout the whole framework of local government. And in relation to changing the Council's purpose, this bill is a solution, and a very poorly conceived one, looking for a problem. And that's because Section 11A of the Principal Act already requires councils to, and I quote, have particular regard to core services of network infrastructure, public transport, solid waste collection and disposal, the avoidance and mitigation of natural hazards, libraries, museums, reserves and other recreational facilities. And it wasn't just the regulatory impact statement which said there was no evidence of a proliferation of council activities since 2003. It was also the report of the Local Government Rates Inquiry in 2007. So the Green Party is opposing this bill, and one of the other reasons is because it takes the local out of local government. It will mean that councils are potentially much more under the thumb and direction of Wellington, and that's because the bill gives the Minister huge powers to intervene and effectively direct what councils do. So instead of local councils and central government operating in their own spheres with councils accountable to local electors, we'll get a very strange hybrid. We'll have local councils who will always have their eye on Wellington and be quite nervous of the Minister intervening through the appointment of Crown observers, Crown managers, Crown review team, or the ultimate sanction of sacking elected councillors and replacing them with appointed commissioners. So these ministerial intervention powers concentrate much more power in the executive. They undermine local autonomy, and they give the Minister a very wide discretion to intervene because of the very generous way in which the trigger for intervention is defined. It's defined as a significant problem. And how is problem defined? And I quote, "It's a matter or circumstance relating to the management or governance of the local authority that detracts from or is likely to detract from its ability to give effect to the purpose of local government within its district or region." That amount allows a huge amount of subjectivity in the Minister's decision. And if it's easier for the Minister to get involved, he or she is more likely to, as it did in Canterbury. And that will cut across democratic decision-making, and it will cut across the fundamental principle of no taxation without representation. And what's most galling under this bill is that if the Minister appoints commissioners, it's not central government who pays for them, it's local electors and local ratepayers who are expected to. So certainly there have been some well-publicised examples of poorly managed council expenditure, such as the V8 race in Hamilton and Kaipra's costly sewage system, but most councils are getting on with their job efficiently and effectively. Most councils are doing it in a financially prudent way. They have a financial strategy. They have a revenue and finance policy. They are audited by the Auditor-General. And in a recessionary climate, we are already seeing in this year's round of annual plans, councils cutting and adjusting their spending. So if expenditure is capped and limited to no more than the ratio of the population growth multiplied by the rate of increase in the consumer price index, This is potentially going to encourage councils to neglect investing in upgrading and maintaining their infrastructure and potentially burdening future generations with an increased cost. And as the law firm Simpson Grierson has noted, benchmarking expenditure to the CPI is troubling because local authorities' costs, especially land and infrastructure costs, are increasing more rapidly than other costs like food costs, which the CPI measures. And the local government cost index would be a much more relevant measure. And we all know too that household sizes impact on the services that councils have to provide. So it's household numbers rather than population growth, which would be a much better measure. But, Mr Speaker, this bill is bad because it takes the local out of local government by the way in which it advances National's agenda of creating supertanker councils, large unitary councils that are difficult for the public to access and to influence. It will see local councils which represent their local communities overwhelmed by the push to create the Auckland model and roll that out throughout New Zealand. And as the Napier City Council has said in a letter to many MPs, and I quote, "It is not reasonable to conclude yet that the Auckland model of local government will serve all in New Zealand well if it is used as a blueprint for every other region," end quote. Outside of Auckland, that three-tier structure with the regional council, the city and district council and community boards works well. If we're going to clean up our waterways, we need to look at what's happening in urban waterways, the impact of stormwater, sewage discharges, as well as rural waterways. Where you have that separation of power between the regional council as an environmental regulator and the district or city council providing the services of stormwater management, sewage system, you get more accountability, more transparency. In Christchurch, we'd still have sewage being discharged, treated into the Avon Heathcote estuary if it hadn't been for the regional council having the decision-making role there, because it was the regional council commissioners which said no to that. The city council wanted to continue to discharge it into the estuary. Government spokespeople have suggested that the current legislation around amalgamations isn't working, and that's presumably because small communities with existing councils are voting to retain the status quo and not amalgamate. To me, that's evidence that the legislation is working well. Votes against amalgamation show, and I quote the Napier City Council, quote, that communities have confidence in the localness of their existing council. They value their ability to communicate directly with local representatives and hold them accountable for the decisions they make, end quote. And that is the unanimous view of the Mayor and all 12 councillors of Napier City Council. So this bill, by changing those amalgamation procedures and giving the Local Government Commission a central role, is anti-democratic because of the procedures that Mr Robertson mentioned, where you have a poll over all electors in the area affected by the amalgamation, not just in each single council area, and by the requirement that 10% of electors must demand that referendum. So that's heavily weighted against small communities who want to retain their local voice and their independence through having their own council. Their voice risks being overwhelmed by all of the electors in the affected area, and that's anti-democratic. So in the Green Party, we care about the places we live, our neighbourhoods and our towns. We want to make them better living places where people are better connected, communities are stronger, more resilient, and where prosperity is shared. We want councils who are the voice for their communities, who manage their finances prudently, who invest in sound infrastructure so that our stormwater and sewage discharges are well treated and don't pollute our rivers. And we oppose the major thrust of this bill because it reduces the voice of local communities, it's anti-democratic, and it allows too much scope for ministers to interfere with local government. It will muddle the accountability of local councils to their electors and make them more responsive to the minister in Wellington.
For the Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, never have I seen a debate in this House that shows how out of